So One Piece chapter 1097 is finally out, and in this chapter we basically got the bulk of Kuma's backstory, and Oda delivered in a big way. Now we still have to learn how Vegapunk and Bonney fit into all of this, which we'll probably get in the next couple chapters I would imagine, but man, seeing Kuma take the pain bubbles for the elderly at the church was a big time tearjerker, and I really loved how Oda even tied this into his role as a priest, because a fair amount of religions in the real world tend to meet once a week, and Oda did the same thing for Kuma's church, but not because of the beliefs or anything, but because he could only take people's pain once a week since he needs to heal in between. And of course, the people that visit him and do this have no idea that he's doing it either. He's just trying to help people all he can, especially because the new king is hell-bent on getting the celestial tribute, so they can't afford to be hurt or sick or anything because they have to earn money still. And I wonder if this might have a role into why Kuma's body had to become a cyborg eventually. Now obviously there's a layer of the government wanting to control him because he's like a full robot at this point, but originally maybe he took so much pain over the years from these pain bubbles, or maybe he took a huge one at some point that we haven't seen yet, and then he had to rebuild his body in a similar way to Frankie when he was hit by the sea train. I think that would be a pretty logical way to kind of tie all of that together. And then after seeing him take all this pain, I really couldn't help but think about how differently I look at the nothing happened moment in Thriller Bark. Now it's hard to compare an old woman's hip pain or whatever to what Luffy was feeling after fighting Moria, but you get my point. And it goes a lot deeper when you consider the fact that Zoro and Kuma were both founding members of their respective organizations. Zoro was the very first one to join Luffy, and then once Kuma joined Dragon, those freedom fighters became known as the Revolutionary Army. We also have come to call Zoro and Sanji the wings of the Pirate King, and those were the two people standing up to Kuma, who is basically one of the wings of Dragon if we were to make that kind of comparison. So it's kind of like Kuma used that opportunity to test them almost, to make sure that Luffy's top brass could take on pain just like Kuma did once a week for so many years. And I think we could have almost assumed that he did something like this because of his line at the very end, where he basically said that he expected no less of Luffy's Nakama since he's Dragon's son, but it just puts it all into new context knowing he took pain like that on the regular. And I think it's really interesting how the creation of the Revolutionary Army basically coincided with Kuma's kingdom being freed. That event is probably tied to why he's known as the Tyrant today. And what happened in Sorbet is, in my opinion, one of many examples that we've already seen in the story where a kingdom of an individual island is basically mirroring an aspect of how the world government as a whole behaves. Because we saw that Sorbet got a new king named King Bikori, whose face is incredibly punchable, and he's a total puppet for the Celestial Dragons. His goal is always to pay the celestial tribute no matter what, not even feeding his prisoners. However, we learn that the tribute is also tied to an island's population, so he ends up basically casting off the southern half of the island as a totally different country, thus lowering the population of his side, but in the process, he's keeping the more profitable ones, you could say, because the South has the elderly and Kuma's church, who are really poor. He literally said his goal was to make the Southerners appear as the vermin that they are over time. And I don't think I really need to explain how messed up that is. I mean, taking care of the sick and elderly is a pretty substantial challenge in most societies as it is in the real world, but he thought, just screw that, they don't count anymore, not my problem, we're just gonna pretend like they're lesser than, basically. And I want to give a big shout out to Saranrap for mentioning that King Bikori might be connected to Saint Mjosgard's dad. So obviously their designs share some similarities, which is the main thing here, but Mjosgard is kind of relevant here because he's being executed in Marijois as we speak, and Kuma was literally just there wreaking havoc. Perhaps Mjosgard was able to escape or something because of that. I mean, Mjosgard is also Don Quixote Mjosgard, meaning his dad is also likely a Don Quixote, and we know that Don Quixote Homing opted to leave Marijois in the past, so perhaps King Bikori is somehow paralleling that, but in a bad way because he's not in Marijois but is still acting quite a bit like a celestial dragon. And also, to keep on this Mjosgard thought for a second, I want to shout out Doron, aka Taco, for this comparison that pretty clearly shows Mjosgard and Green Bull have to be related. I mean, those designs are just way too close if you ask me, and if Bikori is related to Mjosgard's dad and Mjosgard is related to Green Bull, then is King Bikori maybe related to Green Bull somehow? I mean, I doubt that's his dad, but the plot is definitely thickening, I think. And the fact that Bikori cut the island in half like that, I think could be a parallel to the Red Line splitting the world in half. Maybe the government did that back then for a similar reason. I mean, we've seen the Mother Flame cause flooding recently, so maybe like Bikori split Sorbet in half, Emu split the world in half with the Red Line, and then flooded out everyone they didn't want. Now, we do know there was some form of the Red Line before the world government was there, because of that flashback Marco had to Whitebeard talking about it, but Laboon banging his head on Reverse Mountain kind of tells us us maybe that part shouldn't be there at least, so who knows exactly. But I do think the parallel there means something. And I thought a really powerful moment was how as soon as they mentioned enslaving people in that country, Kuma got pissed enough to just start attacking. Kuma has been shown as basically a big teddy bear, no pun intended, pretty much this entire flashback. But the second that they mentioned enslaving people, it tipped him over the edge. And you know who that reminded me of? Jinbei, who is from another race that has suffered greatly by the hands of the world government, both in terms of slavery and just the fact their race has been hunted or not accepted in society. When Jinbei fought Who's Who, he totally flipped a switch right when Who's Who mentioned the fishman's history being a story about slavery, basically. And we see a similar thing here with Kuma. Both Jinbei and Kuma are pretty reserved individuals as well, I would argue, so I think Oda's using that to show us just how bad being a slave is. Like, even the quiet and respectful types get really pissed when you bring this up, and both of them basically shut it down without hesitation. Oda even showed us a fishman freeing Ivankov last chapter where he said he hasn't been praised before. Oda's really taken the gloves off recently in terms of showing us how bad the world government and their allies are, like with God Valley. So I expect we're gonna see even worse things going forward when it comes to the Void Century, and also the slaves in general that are in Marijois now. I mean, we got a glimpse of that with Boa, where she and her sisters were branded and force-fed devil fruits and probably tons of other horrible things that we can probably insinuate. So it's probably gonna be even worse once we get the full story. And that's why Kuma and Jinbei don't even let people joke about it. But then we move on over to the creation of the Revolutionary Army, where Dragon and Ivankov help Kuma free these people from that very fate we just talked about. And I gotta say, it's insane how Oda just casually dropped this line about Dragon being in the Marines at one point. Like, that's a huge reveal to just put in one little word bubble like that. I mean, this is something that's been theorized for years, and just have it casually dropped was kind of crazy. And we kind of got a hint of that recently, I think, in chapter 1087 during the battleship bags, where Garp was training Aokiji, and then he suddenly said, "My son became a revolutionary, damn it." And that didn't necessarily confirm that he was a Marine, but it kind of indicated at least a change of occupation, you could say. And so now that we know Dragon was a Marine at one point, I feel like we have to kind of go back there and think about this some more. I mean, Garp himself may be a Marine, but he doesn't like to listen to the Celestial Dragons. Dragon was once a Marine, and now he is completely opposing the Celestial Dragons and outright declaring war against them. And then Luffy punched the first Celestial Dragon he ever met also, unless we count Shanks as one, but you know what I mean. So while we know the reason Luffy did that, I'm dying to know what Dragon and Garp have both experienced that led them down their paths. I mean, Garp even protected them against rocks at God Valley, which Oda probably isn't showing us for a little longer now, which is a little sad, but the point is just that there's still so much to this that we need to learn. Garp also mentioned that line about Dragon joining the revolutionaries to Aokiji, who he himself was kind of changed through Ohara and then refused to listen to Okainu and left the Marines. And we know Dragon is connected to Ohara somehow because he was there with Vegapunk the very same year he started the Revolutionary Army, which was 22 years ago. And he knew Clover, and he also now calls Robin the light of the revolution for some kind of reason. But Dragon was a freedom fighter before all that happened. So what was his reason for leaving the Marines and joining the freedom fighters? And who started the freedom fighters before he joined? Well, I think that's something we're probably going to get pretty soon, because Dragon's probably showing up by chapter 1100. That's 1,000 chapters after his introduction in chapter 100, where he saved Luffy from Smoker. And with all this new Kuma information and the Revolutionary Army backdrop that we just got, it makes way too much sense for Dragon to show up soon. I mean, imagine him fighting Saturn while they talk about whatever event made Dragon into who he is. I mean, we've been waiting to see Dragon get in action pretty much the entire story, so for him to come in and stop Saturn and maybe fight him for a little bit would be pretty dope. I mean, that would be a great introduction after waiting this long to see him. And Kuma is probably also showing up to Egghead, so the potential there for even more flashbacks is pretty damn high. But at the end of the chapter, we see Ginny actually gets kidnapped. And since we didn't see Bonney at all throughout the chapter, this has kind of led to a bunch of theories about where Bonney and Vegapunk kind of fit into this whole mess. Because throughout most of the chapter, we kind of see the beginnings of Kuma and Ginny becoming more than friends, with her even outright asking him to marry her. Now, based off his response, he seemed kind of hesitant because of his lineage and the fact that she and their children may be hunted down because of their Buccaneer blood. And Tosmorn brought up a really interesting point about this during my stream, where we actually saw Bonney use an attack earlier in Egghead called Distorted Future, and she looked almost like a Buccaneer. And if that's a distorted future, then that would kind of imply that that's different than the current one, maybe showing she isn't a Buccaneer now. And I actually have a theory about this that I'll share in just a minute, but even though he hesitated here, I feel like they probably still did get married. I mean, later they even say Kuma won the heart of a lady that they all admire. However, the thing is, this timeline takes place over the years that Bonney would have been born, which was 24 years ago according to the information we got in SBS 68, and the marriage proposal was 25 years ago. So if Kuma did accept the proposal, they didn't take very long getting to work, assuming that really is her correct age, because there is a lot of what I would consider pretty sound speculation on whether Bonney is actually much younger than she really is, or if she's the age that we've been told. Because we got a couple comments from Vegapunk and Saturn about Bonney being a little girl. She appeared as a little girl after being in that ball of water outside Egghead, but Oda did give us her age in an SBS, which was 24. However, he also included an asterisk and said he was estimating. So the two trains of thought here are basically Bonney is actually 24, like Oda's told us, and like we've seen her, or she is much younger than that. Now, she also did appear as an old woman before, being Connie while at the Reverie, and honestly, that has its own question marks for me because the guards there acted like they knew Connie, like she was a real person. And given that Sorbet was liberated by the Revolutionary Army 22 years ago from a celestial dragon puppet, basically, it's kind of a valid question to ask how Sorbet was still allowed to send anyone to the Reverie at all. It kind of seems like an oversight to me, especially given Bonney is the one who went there, unless there's just something more going on. So I'm going to keep an eye on that going forward. And despite the sound evidence for it, I think Oda's trying to confuse us, and she is actually 24. I think he's trying to throw us off his trail to the real answer by making us think about the age thing. And again, it's not impossible that Bonney is actually young. I guess I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here because I think everyone's kind of on that train, so I'm going to go the opposite side and say that she is 24 and Oda's pulling a fast one. As far as the SBS goes, he could have said he was estimating just because of the simple fact Bonney could be a different age whenever she wanted to. And as far as her being a kid in that ball of water, well, devil fruit powers don't completely negate when you're in the water. Luffy was still rubber in the water, Brook didn't die when he went in the water, etc. So I don't think her powers would cancel out like that if she was in the water either. And then as far as Vegapunk and Saturn calling Bonney a little girl, well, they're both old as dirt, and they would have known Bonney since she was really young. So it kind of makes sense for them to call her that, even if she is 24. So if we assume she is actually 24, then that means Bonney would have been alive already when the Revolutionary Army started 22 years ago. Which on the surface, I'm kind of like, how are you going to take care of a child while creating a boundless army throughout the world? Like, isn't that the worst time to have a kid? But then I also think Dragon had Luffy 3 years later. So clearly the fact they're constantly at war doesn't bother him that much. But then we also have to ask, well, where is Bonney? Because she does have memories of being with her dad, and based off their ages in this little flashback panel in Egghead, it's probably somewhat near the time that Ginny got captured, which was 14 years ago, when Bonney should have been 10. And yeah, it's hard to tell her exact age in this little flashback panel, but 10's probably a good estimate. So where does she fit into all this? Well, I think where this is all going is that Ginny probably got captured by CP0 or some other world government lackeys, and then trying to save her is how Kuma gets strong-armed into helping Vegapunk and the world government, and maybe even becoming a full robot and losing his consciousness as well. And I know there's a boatload of speculation right now about like Bonney being a clone of Ginny, or Ginny being used to make the Vegapunk satellites or something. Like Terrible TJ once said, the box she was sitting on has O2 on it, and Lilith, the first Vegapunk we met, had O2 on her shirt. And York also has some similarities, like the freckles and the fact she eats all the time, and even Atlas has the strands of hair coming down kind of like Ginny did, etc. There's definitely a lot of connections there. And I hate to make it sound like I'm shutting down all those theories, because obviously there's some connections there, but we were told that these were clones of Vegapunk, and they even use his name. They're also all geniuses like him. So it wouldn't be much of a Vegapunk clone if they were based on Ginny, or if they were Ginny clones in any way. However, I will say, clearly the story is going to connect Ginny and Vegapunk somehow, and it probably starts with his kidnapping, I think. So this will likely pull Kuma out of hiding, and maybe even other Revolutionary Army members, and then force him to work for them instead. And this could tie to the flashback Bonney had a couple chapters ago when stabbing Saturn, where she was basically hearing Saturn command Vegapunk to take Kuma's consciousness away. And given that Saturn knows Kuma's a buccaneer, that he escaped God Valley, it would make sense for him to work on getting him out of hiding and back onto their side as a slave. And using his wife or daughter or both to do so sounds like par for the course. So I think the clone stuff's pretty hard to make a call on right now, but where I do think this is headed is that Kuma and Ginny will be forced to do something drastic to save Bonney, and that's probably how Ginny dies. I could almost see it paralleling the Belle Mare scene with Nami, where she basically had to choose who was being saved and chose the kids over herself. So maybe Saturn or the government will propose a similar situation. Like, one of you three need to die no matter what, and Kuma, being as selfless as he is, will probably offer himself immediately. But then Ginny will step in and be the one to die instead, or something like that. And I think this could tie back back to that distorted future comment from earlier, where Bonney may not actually be a Buccaneer now, because maybe Vegapunk's role in Bonnie's life was essentially removing that Buccaneer part of her blood, almost making her a Ginny clone in a very roundabout way where, yes, she is Kuma and Ginny's kid, but then Vegapunk had to remove the Kuma part out of her so she wasn't a Buccaneer anymore. I think this would be a much better way to go about all of this in my opinion, because of course Kuma is still her dad, even if his blood isn't running through her veins anymore, and that would sort of be the lesson here. And then this could all wrap back into Kuma arriving to Egghead perfectly, because he would probably be going through round 2 of all this, where Saturn, Vegapunk, himself, and Bonney are all there together having quite a tough conversation. Except in all likelihood, Kuma will probably be the one to die this time, to yet again save his daughter and friends, and also save the Straw Hats again in the process. I mean, I could see kind of a cool scenario where maybe Kuma latches on to Saturn, paws themselves both away like up into the air, and then maybe he detonates a bomb that's inside of him or something, because he is mostly cyborg at this point, and he tries to take him out. Now, I doubt it would work. I don't think it would actually kill Saturn or anything, but it would probably buy them some time and be like the perfect send-off for Kuma. Or maybe Dragon just takes care of Saturn, which would also be dope. I just want to see something happen. But that's it for this video, guys. Please make sure to drop a like and hit subscribe if you enjoyed it, and maybe check out last week's video where I talked about a bunch of theories regarding the crown jewel of Hachinosu. But until next time, later.